Well, we're going to talk a little bit more about some potential treatment interventions, but since you just brought up the whole idea of transgenerational epigenetic influences,
Yeah.
we have these physical toxicants, maybe toxins, because some can be endogenous, some can be exogenous. When these are deeply embedded in our cells, might people be more likely to retain these toxins because of transgenerational traumas, conflicts? I know Dietrich Klinghardt has spoken about one patient where he was working on heavy metals and working on it from a physical perspective, and then did a mental emotional intervention working on emotional traumas and conflicts, and the lab saw the highest level of excretion of heavy metals that they had ever seen. So
Yeah.
is the solution to a lot of these intracellular toxins entirely physical interventions, or is there benefit to working on the mental emotional realm that thus then allows the body to release these retained toxicants?
I think all of it, and it's different for different circumstances. If I can add to that, the transgenerational observations of epigenetic effects, I found a great study of the effects of DDT, basically agricultural exposure to DDT. And the study took it to, I think it's the F4 generation. So basically 4 generations down, you still had not the DDT in the cells measurable, but the effects of DDT on the genome, meaning the epigenetic footprints, and thus the genomic switching, meaning expression versus not of gene regions, up to 4 generations down, with certain cases of starvation and famine in Scandinavian countries where they kept excellent records. In the 1860s through 80s, there were a series of natural events that led to periodic starvation, and that cascading effect is still present today. And then one of my favorite examples is so back to World War II, in the winter hunger of 1944-45, we had the Dutch resistance putting up an admirable effort, and the Nazis didn't like that. So they basically starved out whole regions of Holland. And Audrey Hepburn was caught up in that as I think a 15-year-old teenager. And several times she almost died. They ate tulip bulbs, etc., that they ground into flour to survive. And she and her family almost died. And if you think of, some of her most spectacular appearances, Breakfast at Tiffany's or Roman Holiday, we think that from those near death from caloric stress, low caloric stress or starvation, is why she had this almost bird-like, near transparent bone structure and complexion. And so again, there's a difference between the epigenetic influence on the somatic cells and then also on the germline, because she ended up not being overweight her lifetime. She did end up having an earlier death in her 60s, I think, which seems a little early for her, potential. But in her children, if you look at other people or other families or bloodlines from that era, to this day, so many of them, the dominant percentage of them, have symptoms of a cellular milieu that is switched so hard to conserve calories and not burn them because they may not be food tomorrow. And the observation is that there is a significant increase in diabetes, obesity, high cholesterol, heart disease, etc. And so that's just from one factor, probably the stress, but most specifically the stress on the genome to survive under extraordinary low caloric conditions. And so I also presented to you the transgenerational effect of DDT and other toxins, agricultural toxins. I found some studies that does highlight in, primarily agricultural families, the higher incidence of some of these same conditions, obesity, heart disease, and then neurodegeneration in terms of Parkinson's. That is certainly part of the direct chemical exposure, but transgenerationally, and we don't know for sure if it's as a consequence of the linear transmission of chemicals or exposure between different generations, but it certainly switches the genetic expression, and that switching is what gets passed on down the line for up to 4, 5, maybe more generations at this stage. So it's extraordinary. What we live today is the cumulative epigenetic programming of the germline, really. And it does include infections, toxins, psycho-emotional stressors. So I love that Dr. Klingner teaches it. And then again, with the epigenetic study of the footprints on the cell biology, we're able to now bring that into the clinician's office to a much greater degree. And the beauty of this is that it is pragmatic. It is clinically actionable in so many different ways. Because what we see is we study the cellular structures and we can see deviations from optimal. And whether it's as a consequence of toxins or psycho-emotional stressors, it matters, but for the clinician, maybe not that much, because you can see right in front of your eyes what you need to correct to get someone out of the survival response, which we talk about as the CDR these days.
It will be interesting to see what the transgenerational epigenetic effect is on future generations from the last few years of living on planet Earth with the pandemic. I have to think it's not going to be positive. And so with that, I think some of this conversation at this point sounds a little dire. So people hold on, because we will get into some tools and some hopeful things. We're not going to leave it here where it sounds like doom and gloom. So
oh yeah, absolutely. No, if I can just jump in there, we're talking about a flexible, we're talking about a plastic situation. Plasticity is the word I'm referring to, not the chemical plastic, right? So these are acquired, the epigenetic effects, whether it's psycho-emotional, traumatic, mechanical is in a different category. That belongs mostly to own lifetime mechanical trauma. But the effects of toxicity, infections, inflammation, you can absolutely undo it, because as the environmental factors imprint and as an epigenetic influence that shifts the way your genome expresses in relation to the environmental stressors, if you show, and we can talk about this in a little bit later, but if you show the cells how wonderful life really is, you can disacquire and undo it. And then here's the beauty, Scott, is if you do it early enough, you can pass that on to your children and your lineage. So it is very hopeful and it is very optimistic. It doesn't have to be dire, but as life goes, it requires action. You can't just watch it.
Definitely feels at times like it requires a lot of action, but I agree with you that I think there's a lot of hope.